Let's talk about the supply and demand model. This is a model that predicts price of a good in a market given two actors: suppliers, people who produce the good, and consumers, people who create the demand for that good. The intuition behind this model is relatively well known. If supply of a good goes up and demand is unchanged, then the price of that good will go down. If demand for a product goes up and supply doesn't change, that will drive the price of that good up. Similarly, if the price of a good rises, then all other things equal, demand will go down. This model also assumes that all markets clear. In this model, when there is equilibrium, supply meets demand and all markets clear. There is no extra production that is unsold, and there is no excess demand, people that actually wanted the good and could not get it. Now let's look at the graphical interpretation of this model. First, we will need a demand schedule. This is information from the market about how much people are willing to pay to have a certain product and what quantities will be demanded at each price. So for instance, let's think of the housing market. Say that if rental prices are $500 a month, we will have 700 people total that are interested in living in a specific neighborhood. And when rent is $1,000 a month, we will have 400 people, and so on. So we put together the information that we get in the market regarding price and quantity, and we can create a graph. At $500, we have a demand for a total of 700 units. At $1,000, the demand is 400 units. This is how we obtain what we called the demand curve. One of the characteristics of the demand curve is that it slopes downward for a normal good. So as the price rises, the quantity that this economy will demand of a particular good decreases. This results in a downward sloping demand curve. Similarly, for the graphical analysis of the supply side, we need to know the price and the quantity supplied of this good at each particular price. So let's say that if rent prices are $2,500 a month, we will have 500 total units, homeowners that are willing to rent their places. If the price is $200 a month, we will have 400 places available, and so on. So the information of prices and quantities that can be supplied at each price allows us to create the supply curve, which is upward sloping, and in this case, in the demand for housing, will look like this. So this will be our supply curve. In this model, we say we have equilibrium when the supply curve and the demand curve meet. So in this case, the equilibrium point will be 200 point E, 200 apartments rented at $1,500. So once we understand that the equilibrium point comes from the intersection of supply and demand curves, we can start analyzing what happens when we have a demand change. Assume that we have an increase in demand. This will mean that the demand curve shifts outward. Imagine that a big company moves to town and we have thousands of people now that are looking for rentals and the supply hasn't changed. So what we would say in this analysis is that an increase in demand will bring us to this point E2, where we have 340 houses roughly being rented at $2,000 each. An increase in demand when everything else stayed equal meant that we have an increasing price. Or we could imagine that similarly that company moved away from the city and a lot of the people that worked in a specific company lived in this neighborhood. Now our equilibrium point moves to 3 when demand is reduced. So here we have a reduction in demand and here we have an increase in demand. So when we have a reduction in demand, we end up at equilibrium point 3, which is where we are renting about 110 units for about $1,100. Now let's look at what happens when we have a supply change. If supply shifts, imagine that a contractor or a developer builds 1,000 new apartments in our little neighborhood. So the supply curve will shift outward, and that increase in supply will settle for a new equilibrium point where we think 400 homes will be rented at about $800 per month. Or we could also think of a decrease in supply where, let's say, there's a bad flood and people can't live in a number of the houses, our supply shrinks, then the supply curve moves inward, and our new equilibrium price when supply is lower means that 150 houses will be rented here in E3 for a price of about $1,700. So we say that if supply goes up and demand doesn't change, price of the good will be reduced, and if supply is reduced for whatever reason without changing the demand, price will increase. Mathematically, in this model, what we're doing is looking for the intercepting point between two lines. So we have a system of two equations with two unknowns, price and quantity of equilibrium. So the first line is the demand curve. The quantity demanded is a constant plus the slope of the demand curve, MD, times the price of demand from the demand schedule. And the supply curve has a similar structural equation of a line with a constant plus the slope times price. When quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, we solve for this system and we find the equilibrium price. So, as a summary, the model of supply and demand predicts the price and quantities of a good that will be produced and consumed in an economy. Also, the model predicts that changes in demand and supply will have an impact on price. And finally, the last prediction is that a change in price will have an impact on demand for a good. That's it. Thank you for watching.